I can see people coming in. Welcome, everyone. We'll just give it a minute or two for others to join us, and then we can start. Okay, I think we'll start now. So, hello, everyone, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us today as we launch our Investing in Safety model resources. I'd like to start by introducing myself. My name is Selma Taha, and I'm the Executive Director at Southall Black Sisters. This event is organized by the No Recourse No Safety partners, which alongside Southall Black Sisters, we have Latin American Women's Rights Services, Safety for Sisters, Ubuntu Women's Shelter, and previously the Angelou Center. We're a group of specialist community-based by and for services based up and down the UK. Our services are designed and delivered by Black, minoritized, and migrant women and girls. And we provide frontline support, and we campaign for Black, minoritized, and migrant victim survivors of harmful practices and various forms of violence against women and girls. Very grateful to Comic Relief for funding this work under their Changemakers grant. Our work is centered on supporting victims and survivors who have no recourse to public funds, as well as challenging the environment in which they live. No recourse to public funds, or NRPF, is a restrictive condition that prevents one from claiming welfare support if they have insecure immigration status. Currently, around 2.6 million people in the UK are affected by this condition. In our frontline experience, victim survivors with NRPF are frequently turned away from refuges as they're not able to claim housing benefits. And they're also consequently often forced to choose between being abused, becoming homeless, destitute, and even deported. Research has shown us that NRPF is extremely detrimental for the life chances of victim survivors. There is no place for NRPF in any modern nation that cares about eradicating violence against women. Southall Black Sisters, we've been campaigning for over 3 decades to have the draconian NRPF condition lifted. And over time, we've succeeded in pushing for the introduction of vital support provisions, such as the Destitute Domestic Violence Concession, or DDVC, now also known as the Migrant Victims of Domestic Abuse Concession, or MVDAC, and the Domestic Violence Indefinite Leave to Remain, or DVILR. However, as these protective measures extend to only a certain cohort of migrant women, migrant victim survivors, our fight to have the combined model extended to all migrant victim survivors, regardless of their immigration status, continues. In 2021, pending a longer-term decision, the Support for Migrant Victims Pilot Scheme, or SMV as it's well known, was launched to provide emergency support for migrant victim survivors with NRPF. Southall Black Sisters leads on the delivery of the Support for Migrant Victims Fund alongside delivery partners across the country. However, the framework of protection for migrant victim survivors continues to be inadequate, with provisions not extending to all migrant victim survivors and or, it's being short-term in nature. Scrapping the NRPF condition is recommended by several experts. Most recently, the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls, Rima Salim. There's no question that scrapping no recourse to public funds is the morally right thing to do. Alongside other frontline organizations supporting some of the most vulnerable victim survivors we will keep campaigning for this and for more support for victim survivors with no recourse to public funds. On conducting our cost-benefit analysis, we found that our work supporting victim survivors with NRPF also results in savings for the state. This is something that those who work at buy and for services have known for decades. Our service users face extraordinary barriers in accessing support, and our support provision is uniquely tailored to their needs. This ranges from providing communication in their specific languages, and the languages that they're comfortable with, to supporting them in navigating local public services and immigration pathways. Research has shown that victim survivors from Black, minoritized, and migrant communities much prefer the support from buy and for services because of its specialist nature. What the Investing in Safety model does is help quantify the value of our work. It shows that the savings to public services over 3 years would be upward of £127 million if specialist buy and for support were to be available to all victim survivors with no recourse to public funds across the country. Today, we're launching a cost-benefit calculator, which is based on robust financial analysis, and accompanying the report detailing the findings of this analysis. This calculator is free to download and use, and we strongly encourage commissioners in local service areas to use this calculator to create an invest to save business case. Our services are hard pressed by a lack of sustainable funding. The Domestic Abuse Commissioner, who we will have the honor of hearing from today, has highlighted that despite being extremely effective, buy and for services are 6 times less likely to receive government funding. Our cost-benefit analysis makes the case for investing in safety and commissioning services that not only provide tremendous value supporting vulnerable victim survivors, but also produce significant savings for the state. As the name says, we hope this will lead to greater investment in safety. So we'll now hear from our panelists, and after we hear from the panelists, there will be time for audience questions. So please do add your questions in the chat function, and we will go through them at the end. There's also a link to a feedback survey that will be put in the chat. So please, if you could take time to fill this out, this will help us greatly. But before I pass on to our first speaker, I just want to share that we've just in the last hour received information that Alex Davis-Jones, the Shadow Minister for Safeguarding and Domestic Violence, is no longer able to join us as she's been called away urgently. Unfortunately, also due to being unwell, Jasmine Mohammed from Safety for Sisters will not be able to join us either. And of course, we wish her a speedy recovery. So I'll now pass on to our first speaker, Fiona Shield, the researcher behind Investing in Safety, to walk us through the research process that went into the cost-benefit analysis and some of its findings.
Thank you, Selma. I'm just going to share my slides, if that's okay. Can I just check? Can someone just confirm that everybody can see these? Brilliant. Okay, thank you. Well, lovely to be with so many of you today. My name's Fiona Shield, and I'm an independent researcher and strategist specialising in ending violence against women and girls, and particularly the interface between commissioning and specialist services. And I was privileged enough to lead on this project on behalf of the No Recourse No Safety partners. So I want to talk you through 3 things today. Firstly, the question of what is cost benefit. Secondly, I'm going to introduce you to the cost benefit calculator. And finally, I'm going to talk you through some of the findings from the process. So the first question then is, well, what is cost benefit? So cost benefit is showing the financial difference created by a proposed change. So the proposed change is putting in place a service by and for Black, minoritized and migrant women to support victims and survivors with no recourse to public funds. And the financial difference that we're interested in is a change that creates to the spend in local public services. And so what have we produced? We have produced an Excel model that is a cost-benefit calculator that, number one, you can adapt by putting in your local data to reflect your local population. And number two, you can use this calculator to make your own spending decisions and to advocate a business case to invest in victims and survivors with no recourse to public funds. And the public services we looked at, the local public services we've costed for, are the NHS, both physical and mental health services, the police, housing and homelessness services, MARACs, and also children's social care. So how did we do this? So the findings in the calculator are based on a programme of research. What we did is we modelled victim and survivors' needs and how that then manifests in public service demand. And we looked at that across two different scenarios, the scenario where there is no buy and fall service in place and the scenario where there isn't one in place. So we looked at where there is and where there isn't and compared the cost impact on local public services in the two scenarios. The research is based on 30 detailed case studies drawn from across the No Recourse partners, and the partners themselves work with around about 1,000 victims and survivors with no recourse every year. So a huge pool of knowledge that we were drawing on. And importantly, what we also did was framing the research programme. We called upon an advisory group who met throughout the programme, formed of commissioners, decision makers and budget holders from across local public services. And that includes senior representatives at Manchester, Newcastle, Greenwich, Islington and Birmingham councils. It includes the Deputy Police and Crime Commissioner for the West Midlands.
Fiona, we can't hear you. I think just give her a minute to see if she can reconnect. So sorry about this, everyone. Oh, she's dropped out. We're just trying to see if we can get a hold of Fiona. 1 second. I've just been told she's trying to rejoin us, so we'll give her a minute or so. So Fiona's having a little bit of, she's having some issues with the internet, unfortunately. So we're going to move on to Lavanya, who is Southall Black Sisters NRPF team leader. And she'll be speaking a little bit about the differences buying for specialist services and support makes to victims of violence, again, domestic violence, and with no recourse to public funds.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lavanya, and I'm the No Recourse team lead at Southall Black Sisters. We were hoping to have a victim survivor speak at the event, but unfortunately, due to some unforeseen circumstances, last minute, we were not able to get her to speak. However, I will be sharing a case study to highlight the importance of buy-and-force services and what difference they make to the women's lives that are from Black and ethnic minority groups. I'm going to present the case study of Sarah. Sarah is Black African, and she was referred to us in 2022 in August after an incident of domestic abuse. Her partner had kicked her, slapped her, and hit her, and she fell to the ground during the attack. And she contacted to she managed to contact a friend during this attack, who then contacted the police. The perpetrator fled before the police arrived, and Sarah was taken to the hospital. She stayed there till she got appropriate medical treatment, and the hospital staff were kind to accommodate her while they made an IDVA referral. However, since Sarah did not have a secure immigration status and she did not have access to public funds, she could not be assisted by the IDVA service. And Sarah was left in a limbo for a couple of days where she did not know where she was going to go next. Although her medical treatment was completed, the hospital could not discharge her, as they were really worried about Sarah becoming homeless and in turn being vulnerable to other forms of abuse while she was out on the streets. So the hospital was then able to contact us, and we were able to contact Sarah to conduct a risk assessment. We then discovered that she was already fleeing gang violence and also domestic abuse and threats to kill and kidnap from her home country, and she barely about managed to get into the UK. Although she has been in the UK for about 10 years, she was not able to establish any long lasting contacts. She was not able to have any meaningful relationships with anybody because the perpetrator kept her isolated, and she did not have access to any resources that would have helped her escape this abusive relationship much earlier. Since she did not have recourse to public funds or the right to work, she felt that she needed to stay in the relationship or she would be homeless. When we've done the risk assessment, we've realized that she has faced physical abuse, emotional abuse, psychological abuse, verbal abuse, coercive and controlling behavior, threats of deportation, financial abuse, isolation, sexual abuse, and sexual violence in a partnership. After Sarah has come in contact with us and after we've conducted the risk assessment, we were able to identify what her support needs are. And the biggest one highlighted being access to safe accommodation and subsistence. We were able to provide her a safe accommodation immediately, and we were able to provide her weekly subsistence. Sarah meets with her caseworker, who's also from a BME community, every Wednesday, and we were able to have conversations that were very emotional conversations where we had shared understanding of race and how that may interact and how that may interfere with her getting support in a wider network. Sarah also attends weekly support group that are facilitated by Southall Black Sisters. And Sarah has a better understanding of abuse and her rights in the UK. And Sarah, being from a background where she has complicated immigration status, she was not able to get legal help for a really long time. We were also able to arrange that, and now she has solicitors in place who are able to conduct her legal casework. And in this particular case, we needed to do an exceptional case funding, which is not something regular domestic abuse services do. So we were able to train our staff to ensure that we can get this exceptional case funding application in place so that Sarah can access legal aid to then further put an application with the Home Office. Currently, we are at a place where Sarah has her application sent off to the Home Office, and we're waiting on a result from them. And I think what I want to highlight is that it's absolutely paramount that by and for services are provided with overall support so that women like Sarah do not slip through the gaps of service provision. BME women already exist in margins, and the absence of by and for services will only push them further into the margins of society, and it would not let them access help that they so desperately need. Thank you.
Thank you, Lavanya, and especially for jumping in at such short notice. I'll now pass on to Nicole Jacobs, the Domestic Abuse Commissioner.
Great. Thank you, everyone. It's great to be here, and really inspiring to hear Lavanya talk about the kind of really detailed and specialist work. I think it gives us a real sense of the kind of approach that SBS, LARS, Safety for Sisters, and Ubuntu all bring, which is so much of why we're all here today and interested in making sure that we have funding models in place and resources in place which help us have more of these types of services. And it's so inspirational to hear the case study itself, because although we haven't heard directly from Sarah, we have a very good understanding of all of what she's been through and how complicated and specialist the work is. But also, one of the things that I think never comes across as well in these kinds of presentations is just the environment and the welcoming and the feeling a part of by and for services that many victims and survivors really value. And it gives them this bridge to support, trusting of possibilities and trying different things to kind of not only settle their status, but really enter into and be a part of a community. And that is much harder to describe. And so I think Lavanya did a great job of explaining what that kind of detail work looks like. And it's really important. Thank you hugely for allowing me to say a few words. I'm privileged enough to work alongside and see the work up close of SBS and Lars, Safety for Sisters, Ubuntu, you mentioned earlier, the Angelou Center. I'm really grateful to the funders who allowed this kind of work to happen, and the work that Fiona, I'm sure, will come back and tell us about shortly, is really fascinating. So for those of you who may not know me and my role, my name is Nicole Jacobs. I'm the Domestic Abuse Commissioner for England and Wales, and my role was created as part of the Domestic Abuse Act, which received royal assent a couple of years ago now. My office is set up to be independent of government. So I'm a public appointee. The people who work on my team here at the office are on civil service contracts, but we operate as an arm's length body of government and really guard that independence and that ability to say when we need to do better and to do things differently. This is a very good case in point, which I'll explain in a little bit. But also we are in a position where we can advise government, see things very closely in terms of what progress is happening or not, give our best advice, make sure that we're trying to make as much room and clear communication between civil servants, ministers at the local level as well, to really hear the right people who've been out working and developing so much expertise and advice. So it's not just about my office, it's also about, you know, how we create opportunities together. That being said, we have an ability to seek information from public bodies. At the Commissioner's office, I'm able to make recommendations to public bodies by that legislation that I am able to have responses by legally in 56 days. Sometimes government will negotiate some changes to that, but it's a high expectation, and those powers are there to really push forward in the momentum for change. And so we try to do that in any number of ways, and we work kind of across government. But one of the things that has been really important is the focus of this discussion on migrant survivors who have no recourse to public funds, which have been, even though there's been huge efforts to raise awareness, to really campaign. And I think there's a huge amount of people, I would say, I know I can't speak for the shadow minister, but I know there's many people in the Labour Party and other parties who have really advocated for some of the changes that we're talking about today. I think that's very encouraging. But the fact is, while I've been the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, we haven't made significant strides. Government hasn't conceded to some of these changes. And that's why the timing of this model and the resources are so very important. A couple of interventions that I've made have been to use the powers of our office to table a couple of reports. One was called Safety Before Status. We were using some of the rhetoric that we were hearing politicians tell us over and over, was that, of course, they would prioritize safety before status. And so we use that term for our own report. And that is just to remind us all that, of course, quite obviously, we must understand that we have to consider the individual and a victim of domestic abuse and prioritize that at all times over status. And the problem we've had is that rhetoric has not been matching our policy decisions within government. And that's partly why we've laid those reports. But safety before status, we did with some kind of work prior, some reports. It was heavily drawn on reports from the domestic abuse sector, from victims themselves, who talked to us about the abuse of immigration systems, the immigration abuse that happens, but also this dynamic, which really comes out in the discussion today, which is how heavily relied upon by and for services are by a whole range of frontline services, and how unacknowledged that work is. And that certainly comes through in our funding, but in all ways, it came through extremely clearly in this report. And one of the other things that came through in the report, which we made recommendations about, was the fear of systems because we don't have a clear firewall in place, so that anyone who might be seeking support, someone like Sarah, if we think about how Lavinia described her isolation, of course, someone in Sarah's situation would not think that the police would likely help them or help her. There would be a huge fear of what the implications would be to reach out to the police. And so we must make that clear. We have to have a firewall in place in order to give that certainty to victims of domestic abuse that, of course, they could reach out to systems for that kind of support. Often the abuse is being done by perpetrators who are British citizens, British nationals. We're allowing perpetrators to abuse further by not having these kinds of things in place. And so there is an amendment. We all are waiting for an election, I know, and everyone is focused on that. But there's some legislation that's pending right now that have some very relevant amendments being debated, one of which is about no recourse, which I don't want to step on SBS's toes. I know there's a lot of work going on that I support. And one particular amendment that I've tried to work on as much as possible is a firewall amendment. So let's all remember to get in touch with our MPs and advocate for these kinds of amendments. This is particularly in the Victim and Prisoners Bill. Just one more word. I don't want to take up too much time before I'm sure we need to pass back to Fiona, who's likely still with us or back with us. Is about the other report which I produced, or my office did, which was the patchwork of provision. And I think the information from that report really sits nicely alongside these new the investing in safety model resources that you're hearing about today, because that mapping was all services for domestic abuse in England and Wales. Obviously, it's at a particular point, might have slightly changed by now, but in general, it gives us a very good sense of what is provided. And one of the things I'm proudest of about that report is mapping services that exist, but also having asked thousands of victims and survivors what their experiences of seeking services were like for them in the past 3 years. And for people who were from minoritized communities, what we use all sorts of terms, but who I would say would be looking to by and for services, by far and away wanted those types of services and were found it very difficult to access or find those services. And that is not because SBS, LARS, Safety for Sisters, Ubuntu wouldn't gladly welcome and want to support. It's that restriction in funding and the scarcity of services, which are the reason for that. And then the ultimate irony in that report was that when we asked the outcomes for the people who did get to services, who did get to buy and for services, specialist domestic abuse services, or more general services, it was absolutely obvious that the highest outcomes were in the buy and for services, in terms of people feeling that their safety had been addressed, that they were feeling much better about their situation. And that was quite stark. So the reason we could do that is because we could compare people, sadly, 40% of the people who responded to my survey had never reached a service. So we could see what their outcomes look like as compared to people who got to buy and force services, people who got to specialist domestic abuse services, and it is a marked difference. And yet, of course, as was said earlier, buy and force services are 6 times less likely to receive statutory services. We asked, where is your funding coming from, to the services that we map. So we have a lot of work to do. And again, in the Victim and Prisoners Bill, one of the things that is an amendment that we are working on with others and really pushing for, they're tabled by Lord Russell, these amendments, is a specific buy and for pot, a sustainable funding strategy for buy and for services that is sitting in terms of responsibility at the national level, so that we can see that patchwork and the provision and understand where we have our gaps. So no better time than to really look at seriously Fiona's work and understand how we can use these calculators and understand how to bring all of this information together and really drive change going forward. There are some opportunities ahead. I feel I have to say that as commissioner, it's very frustrating how long it feels we've had to make these arguments. But I think having this information, the cost benefit in the public domain with some really credible work is really, really important. And I hope that some of our reports sitting alongside this have helped with that. I always think a cost benefit sounds amazing, but I tell you what, anecdotally, what it looks like to me is, you know, when I visit, as I did yesterday, a group of survivors who've said things, who did say things to me like, I don't have any family in this country. This group is my family. Like, this is my network. This is how I am, you know, navigating so many things in life. And what the cost benefit starts to look like with real people is, you know, them then also describing the kinds of volunteering they were doing, the kind of engagement and participation in their community, that feeling of settling in and having those steps and that future ahead of them, which is so much more promising and is so much better supported because of the kind of support they've had. That's what it really looks like in real life. The same when I visited Safety for Sisters. One of my best memories of being a commissioner, in my role as commissioner, is sitting in the garden with women who'd been living in the refuge at Safety for Sisters, and talking to people who I was happening to talk to them right at a time when a lot of their difficulties in terms of their no recourse to public funds, the immigration issues were starting to kind of untangle and get sorted out. And some of them were working, some of them were volunteering, hugely contributing to their community, very happy and feeling very a lot of camaraderie in their own right. That is what the cost benefit actually looks like in people, if that makes sense. And certainly, and without dwelling on it, you know, whenever I'm working or visiting with a buy and for service, it is absolutely true when you ask who is signposting and referring to you. It is absolutely our frontline services of all kinds, including domestic abuse services that are maybe larger, maybe receiving statutory funding in their area, and heavily relying again on the buy and for service who's not probably as well funded in many cases. So there's so many ways we see this day to day and so many ways we can solve it. So I want to hand back over to who I think probably will be Fiona again, and to hear what she's done. But thank you very much. You have my absolute support. Huge congratulations to getting us this far. And I think there's a lot of hope to using these tools in the future to best effect. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you for coming to speak to us today. And yes, we do have Fiona back. So I'll hand over to you, Fiona.
Hi, I'm so sorry about that, everyone. That
That's
is
okay.
terrible timing, isn't it? I'm going to start from the beginning again, if that's okay with everyone. everybody. Can I just check you can see that, everybody? Right, okay, fantastic. So just to recap, my name's Fiona and I led on this research on behalf of the No Recourse No Safety partners. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is what is cost benefit. I'm going to introduce the cost benefit calculator and I'm going to share some of the findings. So what is cost benefit? So a cost benefit analysis shows the financial difference created by a proposed change. So the proposed change is putting in place a service by and for Black, minoritized and migrant women that specifically supports victims and survivors with no recourse to public funds. So we're looking at the financial difference created by putting that in place as opposed to when that service isn't in place. And the financial impact that we're interested in is the impact to local public services. And those are listed on this slide, to the NHS, to police, to housing and homelessness, to MARACs, and to children's social care. And what have we produced? We've produced an Excel cost benefit calculator. But firstly, you can adapt by putting in your own local data to it, and we'll explain how that's done later. And secondly, you can then use it to inform your own spending decisions and your own advocacy in your local area to support victims and survivors with no recourse. So it very much sits beside the moral case that Selma and Nicole have already laid out today. So how did we produce the calculator? So sitting behind the calculator is a research program that was based primarily around 30 detailed case studies shared by the No Recourse partners. And to contextualize that, the No Recourse partners work with around about 1,000 victims and survivors with no recourse annually. So they're incredibly experienced in this area. And we did a detailed analysis of those cases, looking at what had happened to them before, during and after the buy and for service. And the thing we were really interested in is how women's needs end up becoming public service demand, because they don't always happen. There's so many barriers, not least, of course, the no recourse barrier, the barrier presented by perpetrators for need to actually become demand on public services. The whole process was supported by an advisory group of senior public service commissioners, decision makers and budget holders from across England. It also included Cascan and LSE as well, who had done the modelling work for the Domestic Abuse Commissioner. And in our approach, we were very specifically wanting to be feminist, by which I mean we wanted to be completely transparent and accountable. We wanted to make sure what we produced was credible. And we also wanted to produce something that was accessible and useful, so it had value beyond just this single project, but is hopefully something that everybody on this call today can go away and you can take aspects of the work that we have done and you can reuse it in your own policy work, in your own commissioning decisions and in your own advocacy and applications for funding. So now I'm just going to introduce the calculator. Okay, so what I'm going to do is share a series of screen grabs from the calculator. And this first one here is the first tab on the calculator. It's a tab called About, which explains how the calculator is used. I'm not expecting you to read it. I'm just putting it here to kind of illustrate what it looks like. And if you look at the bottom of this slide, you can see circled in red are all the tabs of the Excel calculator. Now, two of these are in green, the About tab that we're looking at the moment, and the one next to that, which is the Dashboard tab. Now, it's on the dashboard that you can input your own local data, and that it also generates the findings that you would then take from it. All the tabs in grey are our background working. It includes our references for all our sources for our costs. It includes our inflation indexes, and it also includes the kind of nitty-gritty of our calculation. And you also might be able to see that also included in here are all the different tabs for the different commissioning budgets. So health, MARAC, housing, police, and children's.
Fiona, sorry
Yeah.
to interrupt you before you go any further.
No
I'm just
worries.
noticing that you can't see all the tabs. So I'm assuming everybody...
Okay, that's fine. It's more kind of just illustrative rather than, I'm not expecting people to read it. My hope in showing this is just to make people kind of comfortable with an idea of what's inside it rather than talk through it in any detail. And so the next slide I want to show you here is an example of how we have constructed the different costs for the different public service areas. So what we've done is we've taken each commissioning area and we've worked out which other services or interventions that women and their children are most likely to use during and after their abuse. And highlighted in red here is an example of how we have constructed one of these costs. I've taken quite a simple one. So this is from the tab for children's social care costs. And I've highlighted the one which shows how we've constructed the cost for a social services referral to children's social care. So it's only got two cost components. And in here we have the reference for where those costs are drawn from. And this actually refers to a report published by the Department for Education. And all those references are listed in the reference tabs. So what you can do is you can see where we've developed our costs from. And maybe in your local area, you have different costs for your referrals that you know, and you can use those instead. And just to contextualize this a little bit, I spoke to a former colleague from a relatively small London local authority this week, and she told me they've just worked out that they spend £7 million a year on children's social care referrals. So that alone is a huge spend. And so for each public service area, we list all of these, how we've constructed all of these costs. And then finally, on the calculator itself, I'm just going to illustrate to you how you can adapt the calculator. So this here is, again, I'm not expecting you to be able to read it. There's way too much here. But it shows you, this is an extract from the dashboard tab, okay, which produces the findings. And what I want to show you on here is the 4 inputs that you can amend. These are highlighted in the 4 yellow cells. So the first 2 inputs that you can amend are the number of women in your cohort and the percentage of those women who progress towards safety and other positive outcomes. So the calculator, as you will receive it, uses our baseline model. And our baseline model was a cohort of 40 women, 75% of whom moved towards positive outcomes and safety. Now you might want to vary that for your local area. And the 3rd and 4th inputs that you can vary are the cost of the buy and fall service. And we currently have that as £8,132 on average per head per woman. And the final thing that you can amend is the attribution of the cost benefit to the buy and fall service. So the percentage of the cost benefit that you can say was achieved by the buy and fall service, as opposed to, for example, another service that women might be accessing. So those are the 4 inputs that you can vary on the calculator. And obviously, when you download the calculator from the Southall Black Sisters website, you can play around with this and see this in much more detail. But I'm sure you can appreciate it's a bit too much to talk through today. And now what I'd like to do finally is move on to just talking through some of the findings from this project. And there were a lot of findings, so I'm just going to give you some of the headlines. So again, this slide here is again lifted from the dashboard, so you'll be able to find this on the calculator itself. And I just want to highlight a couple of things for you here. So the first thing is on the left, we again have the list of all the different commissioning budgets. Then on the right, what we have is the net savings per woman, which is the bit we're all really interested in, the net savings per woman in each cohort. And this is gained over 3 years. So the total saving per woman over 3 years to local public services is £18,024. And then on the far right, we have the net savings to our baseline cohort. And if you had a different number of women in your cohort, the savings would then be different. But our net savings to, for example, to the NHS are roughly £460,000 for a cohort of 40 women over 3 years. And for example, to children's social care, savings are £200,000 for a cohort of 40 women over 3 years. And in total, savings to local public services for each cohort of 40 women over 3 years are over £720,000. So that's a little insight into the kind of top line findings. And finally, the last thing I'd like to leave you with is just to say a little bit about the Investing in Safety report that accompanies the calculator. So what we wanted to do in producing the calculator is obviously we've created something that you can use and that has complete financial transparency and hopefully informs other research that's looking at the costs related around domestic abuse. But we also wanted to kind of give a narrative to that as well and explain and analyse our findings as they have emerged. So in the Investing in Safety report that is also available on the Southall Black Sisters website, it includes detail about our methodology and detail about our findings. And that includes as well explaining the conservatism with which we have approached this modelling. So it explains to you all of the assumptions we have made. And so you can feel more or less, you can understand, have kind of confidence and in the validity of our approach. And if you don't agree with anything in our approach, you have the understanding so that you can amend that to suit your own perspective on the issues. Also included in the report are chapters on each of these commissioning budgets, so NHS, police, children's, etc. And what each chapter does is pull together where the kind of policy mandate for investing in VORG. So it gives that kind of wider kind of policy piece that's again useful for you when you're making your kind of business case for investment. And also what it does is include the wider financial costs that we couldn't include in the calculator, because the calculator just looks at an immediate 3-year timeframe, because that's what commissioners would most be interested in. And so we miss out on quantifying some really significant financial benefits. For example, reduction in children's adverse childhood experiences. So that's the report, and I encourage you to use both of these tools together. And we hope that combined they create a real powerful tool for investment. We want to counteract the ideology of austerity and the ideology of the hostile environment by demonstrating very clearly in this work and incredibly transparently that there is no cost benefit to this discrimination against women subject to forms of violence against women and girls. So that's it for me. Thank you very much. And again, apologies for the technical issue earlier. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you, Fiona. And as Fiona said, you can access those resources through our website. We've also put the link to the resources in the chat. And at the end, we'll also present a QR code that you can, again, access the resources through. Next, I'll pass on to Carol Judge Campbell, Victims and Vulnerability at Greater Manchester Combined Authority.
Thank you very much. I'm really privileged to have been involved in this work, and I just want to emphasise the critical importance of buy and pour services in terms of work around no recourse to public funds. In Greater Manchester, we are fortunate in that we have an organisation, Safety for Sisters, who have been around for quite a while, who have been leading efforts in this area. And because of their work, and I know Vicky's on this call today, and I'd like to thank her personally for this, and I'm sorry that Jasmine couldn't be here, that they have nurtured other organisations across Greater Manchester. So we are beginning to develop a landscape in the city region of buy and for services that can work around issues associated with no recourse to public funds. And I know that Calder from Rochdale Women's Welfare is on the call, and I think Priya from Saheli are on the call, all agencies that I rely on enormously to deliver services. And without them, I don't know where we would be in Greater Manchester, to be honest. So I really wanted to make that acknowledgement. We're also fortunate in partnership with them to achieve funding for a coordinated approach around no recourse to public funds from the Home Office. We received funding of £680,000 over 2 years. And from that, we've developed a project called the Lotus Hub that involves 5 organisations, 5 buy and for organisations across Greater Manchester, who are delivering much needed services to women who are impacted by no recourse to public funds. And those services include housing, immigration advice, counselling, employment advice, and a range of other services. And that work is immensely important, and I'm really grateful to those organisations. I'd like to really thank all of the organisations who've been involved in this work, and it's been led by Southall Black Sisters, but also the Latin American Women's Rights Service, Safety for Sisters, who are in Greater Manchester, and I say we rely on massively, the Ubuntu Women's Shelter, and the Angelou Centre for their tenacious commitment in this arena. The work that you undertake means that you give a voice to some of the most endangered and marginalised in our communities. And I'm so grateful for that, because the work that you also do puts lead in my pencil when I'm writing my stupid policy reports that impact and make a change. So I'd really like to thank you. Fiona, the author of the report, I mean, you can tell that she's gone above and beyond in the research to deliver a report that is so comprehensive, and it so comprehensively demonstrates the shortcomings in public policy and practice in this area. I'm going to make 3 commitments today. My first commitment is that I'm going to promote and utilise the model across DM. I'm going to encourage all of my professional colleagues in local authorities across Greater Manchester and in health and in other arenas to utilise the model. I'm going to commit to work with Jasmine for Safety for Sisters and with Vicky at Safety for Sisters to ensure that we develop a firewall in Greater Manchester Police around data sharing and immigration enforcement, and we get that in place. And I'm going to commit that Greater Manchester will do all we can to continue to support work around those who are impacted by no recourse to public funds. And I give my offer to all of the agencies on this call. If I can be of any help, if us in Greater Manchester can lend our support to you, all you have to do is ask. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Carol. And I hope the commissioners in the room also join you in making commitments.
Absolutely.
Next, I'll pass on to Gisela Valley, Director at Latin American Women's Rights Services.
Thank you, Thelma. So very quickly, the Latin American Women's Rights Service is a buy-in for Latin American women organization addressing the practical and strategic needs of Latin American women. On the practical side, obviously, we provide services such as the ones in the report and talked about here. But on the strategic side, we also do policy advocacy and campaigning in the areas of violence against women and girls and labor exploitation. So with that very brief introduction, I just want to say that this is a fundamental report and a calculation tool in supporting the eradication of violence against women and girls in the most effective ways. By-enforced services have long known that intersecting inequalities put Black and minoritized women at heightened risk of domestic abuse and other forms of violence. This is a cycle that is both the result of inequality, but also a driver of it. However, Laura's experience when it comes to commissioning is that there are little opportunities for by-enforced services to engage with those teams, both responsible for designing, but also in the services. This translates in practice in a lack of opportunities for by-enforced services, which tend to be smaller and more local, although not always, to engage in commissioning processes and to secure the resources needed for ensuring that vital specialist services are available for the women most in need of them. For our beneficiaries, from our beneficiaries' experiences, we understand that this lack of opportunities for engagement with commissioning processes not only constitute a barrier for Black and minoritized women to be able to access support, but also forces them into a more protracted process to find safety. Often, Black and minoritized survivors have to go through universal support services before being referred to specialist by-enforced services designed to address the often multiple and complex needs of this survivor group in an efficient and effective way. This longer route to support often results in the re-victimization of women who have to engage with similar processes on multiple occasions, often asked to relieve and evidence their experiences of abuse before being able to find safety. Yet, in our interactions with commissioners, the beneficiary's experience is often missed in the design of how services will be commissioned. Perhaps more importantly, the need to use resources in the most efficient manner sometimes misses the need to ensure that resources are used most effectively. What I mean by this is that the efficiency model is based on the highest level possible of outputs, often meaning engaging with those survivors who are easier to reach and whose cases may perhaps require lower levels of interventions to find safety. So you move on to the next case because you don't need to have multiple interventions and you can have higher levels of services provided. This in practice translates in leaving behind those survivors who are harder to reach, such as migrant women who are often unwilling to access services due to fears around their immigration status, and whose cases will often require higher levels of interventions to find safety and rebuild their lives. In a very, very practical manner, once you have to engage with immigration advice, this is going to require a lot more interventions. No recourse to public funds has often the same effect. This dynamic allows vulnerable survivors enduring violence and abuse for longer and waiting until it isn't possible to continue to do so to find support. When this happens, usually levels of risk are much higher and require many more interventions from specialists and statutory services, for example, via MARACs, to ensure survivors' safety, recovery, and access to justice. As is well known, this higher level of interventions will be much more costly to statutory and voluntary services than to provide effective services at the earliest opportunity, such as those provided by Southall Black Sisters, Ubuntu, Angelou, and ourselves. This can also support the best use of resources available to commissioners by addressing, through commissioning practices, the structures that will increase the vulnerability of Black and minoritized women to experience domestic abuse, and the barriers to safety, making the use of commissioning budgets a lot more effective, whilst also supporting the reduction of inequalities that are the cause and consequence of domestic abuse and other forms of violence. For us, the participation in this project is fundamental to making the case for investment in bioenforced services through commissioning practices that respond effectively to the needs of those at the intersections of multiple and overlapping layers of inequalities. This would help ensure consistency of specialist services availability throughout the country, replacing the current postcode lottery facing Black and minoritized survivors. It will also help to ensure a sustainable ecosystem of services that can respond to the needs of survivors, decreasing the potential loss of specialist services with the consequent loss of knowledge and expertise. Additionally, it will ease the pressure on public services by ensuring that survivors can be supported sooner and require lower levels of interventions to ensure their safety, recovery, and access to justice. Finally, it has the potential to transform how VOG is addressed by ensuring that the needs of those survivors who are most at risk and have fewer options to find safety to inform systems of support through better engagement of bioenforced services with commissioning processes for the benefit of survivors in all areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Gisela. Before we go on to the questions, I can see, or I've been told there's a couple of hands raised. If I'm not able to, give you the floor, so to speak, but if you could put any questions or comments you may have in the chat and we can get to them that way. I have a couple of questions. Maybe if I actually, Gisela, as you just spoke, one of the audience's participants is asking around the question is, migrant people who have experienced domestic abuse and domestic violence, is it true that they only get 3 months to be a period of time where they are supported, and only that period of time where they need to get support around, the issues that they're facing from a frontline experience?
Yeah.
Maybe you'd like to answer that.
So from a frontline experience, that is not the case. Bioenforced services provide the support as long as it's needed to ensure survivors' safety and to ensure that they're able to exit situations of violence and also recover from their experiences. I think the question perhaps is referring to statutory support, which I'm sure you're better able to talk about that. Access to welfare benefits for 3 months that has come through the new MDAG. But for voluntary services, no. I mean, we do our best to make sure that we provide services for as long as needed. It will be very, very helpful to be better funded, but we don't leave women behind, no, for sure.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that as well. I have a few questions for you, Fiona. So the first one is around male victims. And the question is, will the costs be roughly the same for male victims as well?
Yeah, I saw that question. Do you know that I think that's a really interesting question. The variables that determine costs are going to be level of need, so how need manifests in male victims. The second thing then is how need then becomes demand on public services. So, are they accessing public services becomes the next question. So, obviously victims of abuse don't access services every time they're assaulted, for example, right? There's a huge discrepancy there. And that typically obviously increases the more vulnerable you are and in proportion to the intensity and severity of abuse. So there's two questions there. And then the third question, which I have to say I don't know anything about at all, is when men present at public services, do they get the same pathway treatment as women do? And I don't know the answer to that, because that will obviously then change what those costs are that incur. I don't know. I would say maybe look at the Respect programme. That may well have done, because that's had social investment, that may well have done some financial modelling that's available.
Thank you. There's also a question around the social return on investment. So could this tool also be used to show the social return on investment for women who do have recourse to public funds?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, one of the reasons we've been so transparent in this, because if you look at a lot of published social return on investment reports, they don't show they're working, and they just come up with some very big figures about how much money they save, and they don't explain it to you. So we've really taken it, but we've really been clear that we wanted to be very transparent in this, because we want people to be able to use this, again, for this cohort of women and also for other cohorts of women. So you can use the logic behind what we've done, and I think you can use some of the costings. Obviously, what's going to be very different is manifestation of need and also access to public services, because the whole thing about this cohort is they were refused and disadvantaged from access to public services. So that bit doesn't translate, but you can certainly look at the cost profile for public services, and I would say can probably copy that right over. What I would suggest that you do, if you do that, is share these workings with any of your local commissioners so they can have a look at it. Go back to that example I used around children's social care referrals. You could look at that and get them to say, oh yeah, you know, how do those fit with what they know about their own internal costings? They may not know more than what we've been able to show, but give them the opportunity to look at it as well. So, yeah.
Thank you, Fiona. Nicole, we've got one here for you. How can the public effectively lobby politicians to make change happen for migrant women?
Well, that's such a good question. I would say, you know, when there are opportunities that are live and right in front of them, take them. So the Victim and Prisoners Bill is something that is pending right now. And there are amendments that are being put forward by peers and are being supported by MPs that have to do with firewall, but also have to do with lifting no recourse to public funds, or expanding that to wider categories of people having access to public funds. So for that opportunity right in front of us, to hear really strongly from you is important. You know, is it realistic given still we have a government who's not accepted those amendments themselves? You know, it's provocative. It makes a point. I think sometimes people feel, you know, if you've got such a strong majority in the government, what's the point? There really is a lot of point in the debating, in the concessions, and the just raising the awareness amongst decision makers in government is hugely important, because whether it's this opportunity or one thereafter, the awareness raising is there, and the kind of coalition of support is being built. And I would say that started very much in the Domestic Abuse Act. I think, you know, SBS and partners and others of us, we know exactly who our champions are in government, and that they stay very interested and aware. And I think bringing that with us into any opportunity is important. But I think it's also really important to raise awareness at the local level as well. You know, decisions and changes come in various ways and various times. And until we achieve the greater, more comprehensive change, you know, this tool can be used. You know, it is decision makers at the local levels. It will be councillors who have to sign off and support you know, these kinds of measures, making sure that the by and force services are supported, integrated into planning for sustainable services. So it's not any one thing or one decision maker, but I definitely think showing your support. I think many people I hate to say this, fairly unaware of what limitations there are in terms of recourse to public funds and the kinds of situations people can be in and still not be able to access some of the support that people would expect. And so anything that you can do that supports these services themselves, the awareness about them, and the kinds of things that decision makers could do at the local level. So there's legislative changes, but there's actually quite a lot of change that could happen that needs no legislative change, that just simply allows for more funding, more access, more resource and kind of leadership. So it is the awareness raising. I mean, one thing we can all do is make sure that, and I've been WhatsApping someone on my team during this event saying, let's make sure we share, how do we share this work more widely, make sure that this incredible work Fiona and others have done, is well known. So these are the kinds of things that we all have to do. And I will definitely do my best as we have in this government, or we're soon to have an election and another government and potentially different decision makers, to really keep at it as a top priority.
Thank you for that. Gisela, as a campaigning organization, well, the frontline service delivery organization, but you've also campaigned on a number of issues. Certainly, we've worked closely together. Is there anything you'd like to add to what Nicole's just said?
I mean, I think I would just add, because she put it so brilliantly, there are those opportunities to make change. It doesn't require legislation. And there's opportunities always to engage with the local authority as well as with MPs and others. So you can always ask for this. I think the only thing that I would add is that often decision makers just seem to think that this is the system that's in place without kind of realizing what's the bigger point. So the bigger point is, why do they, as decision makers, allow for a two-tier system for survivors of domestic abuse? And I think that's really the key question. It's not only about saying this is going to save money, this makes the whole process more efficient, but how can we prevent that your immigration status, for example, dictates what your experience of accessing safety and support is going to look like? And what are they doing to address this? I mean, it's not only a matter of ensuring, the normal efficiencies that decision makers often are talking about, but it's also about addressing those responsibilities that they have in law to ensure there is equality of services. So I think, I would just say that. I mean, saying it, what are you doing to address the two-tier system of support for survivors of domestic abuse, is a really fundamental question on how we engage with this decision maker.
Thank you. Carol, there's a question around your experience of being on the advisory group for this project. Could you speak to us a little bit more about that, please?
I think it was, firstly, really well administered by Southall Black Sisters, who managed the whole process of it. But then Fiona was really clear when she was reporting back at the different stages in the development of the work. And she was really keen for each of the partners in the group to participate, to come up with case studies, to come up with ideas, and she took them on board and was really clear about and the meetings ended and she went, okay, I'm going to do this, and came back and reported back on those things. So it was a really good process. The partners around the table reflected the diversity of partnerships involved in this work, and Fiona was brilliant in terms of pulling that together. Sometimes I often forget this, like listening is much more important than talking, and Fiona's a really good listener, and she took on board partners' ideas, and it was a really delightful process to be involved in. To be perfectly honest, I can't say that about a lot of the processes I'm involved in.
Thank you, Carol, there. We have another question. Maybe actually, Carol, you can start us off, but then if anybody else wants to join in. How can engagement between local commissioning and buy and for services be improved? And what is the impetus for commissioners to be doing?
You know, I think that austerity has completely pulled the soul out of commissioning. And, you know, and I feel really sorry in lots of ways for commissioners that they have now been forced into a very one-dimensional approach to commissioning, where they would like to take a much more multi-dimensional approach, but they're just unable to do that. I also think that when we look at, and now I'm not just looking at statutory services commissioning, I'm looking at, because we have, you know, a very vibrant community and voluntary sector across Greater Manchester who do some amazing work. They are not immune to the racism that impacts upon buy and for services, you know, and, you know, we like to try and pretend that it's only statutory agencies whose decisions are poor because of the impact of racism. Actually, racism is endemic everywhere. You know, sorry, that's a tautology, isn't it? But it is, and it, you know, and we really need to ask all people who are involved in financing of any type to buy and for services to truly look inside themselves and try and counter that unconscious bias that is clearly there and does clearly affect resourcing to buy and for services. When I arrived in Greater Manchester just almost 2 years ago, there was almost no funding for buy and for services, and we've, you know, I've worked in partnership with those services like Calder. I know Calder probably started 20 years ago in Rochdale in a spare bedroom. You know, some people I've seen in the chat have gone, where, you know, how can I, when I don't live in a large metropolitan area, try and help women like this? And it's like, you'll find somebody, or talk to me and I'll put you in contact with Calder, who could maybe talk to somebody in your local area. Those networks are there, but they're just ignored because of that unconscious bias.
Thank you, Carol. Fiona, you've got your hand up. Do you want to come in next?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Carol spoke of up there about how hard it is for commissioners. So I'm an ex-commissioner as well. And I think there's a real moral injury for good commissioners having to have lived through austerity and deliver austerity. It would be good to see more empathy for that. And I think what felt really good about the advisory group was it felt like a space where people who really cared could care and also be quite angry, and also in a collective space where they brought together their expertise and could feel the emotions they feel about these women and their children. And the other thing we want to do with this tool is, you know, there's an assumption that commissioners know everything, right? And actually they're often deprived of skills and access to training. So what we've provided here is real financial clarity for people, because as a commissioner, you do so much internal advocacy, you face so many internal barriers. We've wanted to make them advocates for the buy and for sector with the evidence we have provided.
Nicole, we've got a question. Someone's asking, what support can you give local areas? They say like ours, but they don't say where the local authority decommissioned their specialist service in favor of a generic service. What influence can they have to leverage and to start having, you know, those conversations?
That's a good question. I was just going to add, I'll just say one more thing, and then I promise I'll get to that. I think it's great to have these conversations about the strain on decision makers, including commissioners. I often feel, yeah, we tend to characterize this as kind of a lack of interest or something. I think it's often commissioners at the local level who are real champions, as Fiona and others have said, and they're trying to bring together the right information. There's many obstacles, and I often, I mean, in my mapping report, and this is starting to answer the questioner is, you know, I've made a quite strong statement about prioritizing independent services, specialist services, including buying for services. And sometimes commissioners will say to me, Nicole, we are trying, and it's hard, you know, like, give us some credit, like, for your, you know, you kind of write these recommendations as if we're not trying. And I've also talked to commissioners who've said things to me like, we thought this was a little bit unfair. You don't appreciate that we don't necessarily have services in our area, and that you're kind of assuming and jumping to a conclusion that we're not funding. But then they'll also say, but when we've convened groups in the community, we found a lot more going on than we thought. So I think there is something about just a little bit of humility on everyone's part to say, let's all agree we have an aim, that we really want to push ourselves. We really want to do better. We want to be reaching people, and we may not all know everything about this. And let's just give it let's convene and have a serious, maybe a serious effort here. And it's really, it's been really great for me to go to areas who've then said, once we did convene community groups, we started to see what the possibilities were, and we had good conversations about, you know, maybe it's a community group who hasn't done a lot that relates to domestic abuse, but actually sees quite a lot and actually supports in more informal ways. And then what does that look like growing and developing in particular areas? There's just so much here. And I think it is about, you know, the coalition of the willing, and really getting, making sure that of course, nothing is going to be perfect ever. Like, we're always going to be, you know, evolving and trying our best and learning and then going to the next step. But I think having these tools it really empowers that coalition of the willing to be persuasive and to be more specific. And so that's, you know, knowing, if somebody asked earlier, what can you do? Part of it is just knowing what's out there. What does the research say? What are the you know, the levers that you have? And increasingly, I think we're seeing more and more, including this work today. What can I do? I definitely show an interest in what I try to do in the mapping is I've actually made a recommendation to public bodies to say, if you are a local commissioner and you are considering or have changed to a more generic service, you must notify my office. And because we want to keep a very clear track. I mean, we can't go so far as to say that we have powers over local commissioners or local procurement decisions or all of that. But what we've tried to do is go as far to the edge of that as we can and say, you actually must notify my office, because we're so concerned that we retain that independent sector of support, because it is clearly really so valued by victims and survivors, that we've got to be very, very clear of to what extent people or areas are moving in that direction. And then when areas have done that, it's not unusual for me or someone from my practice and partnerships team to really say to whichever commissioner it is, whether it's a community safety partnership or whether it's a local authority area or a bigger geographical area, we do try to communicate and ask questions, talk about why and how that has happened. And also acknowledge, again, that there's some real you know, it's not anything personal about a service being in-house or sitting at the local. That's not a personal thing. I'm sure very good work is trying to be done there. It's more the perception from the victim survivor's point of view about the independence and that advocacy. There are ways all services can do very, very well. I get that. So it's not completely one thing or another, but what we've tried to do in our office is make very clear that we believe, from evidence and from what survivors have told any number of evaluators in many different places over time, that this independent advocacy is crucially important. And so we can't, you know, in our progress to have more funding, more resource, we have to retain that specialism. And I think that's really important for us all to find ways of doing that. So certainly very open to the person asking that question. If you wanted to talk to me about that, very happy to hear from you in your area directly.
Thank you, Nicole. This one's for anyone on the panel or all of the panel. This model is fantastic and should be adopted widely, especially given the current economic climate. How important is it to have the cooperation of the police for this to be truly effective in practice? I'd like to go first. Maybe Fiona?
I mean, from a financial point of view, if I can just look at I mean, obviously you want their financial contribution, but I think it means more than that, doesn't it? And I think maybe others can speak to the kind of strategic and the credibility of their involvement, which is probably a bigger question, I think, because for this cohort financially, because this cohort present at the police so little, for reasons, you know, that we go into in the Investing in Safety report, there is the financial case isn't the most important thing, I don't think. So I'll leave it to others to answer.
I can try and address it. I think other than when you have police and crime commissioners involved in the process, I think that is quite straightforward. Our experience with MOPAC has been, for example, really interesting in the sense that not only sorry, I meant to say the Police and Crime Commissioner in London, in the sense that not only do we engage with them when you know, commissioning is happening, but also we have had opportunities to interact with them outside of commissioning processes. So they understand what we're about, what we can bring in terms of services and what the needs are for the women that we work with. I think generally, sometimes I worry that we think about, you know, all these different services as independent from one another, and I understand that, but without understanding the multiple interactions they're going to have with one another when a survivor of abuse is going to come forward. And I think in that sense, wider conversations that address, I think as Nicole has put in her report, systems are really needed. And for that, police is very crucial. And I'll stop there because I can see her hand up.
I just thought I would, yeah, say a couple of things I might say to the role of the police. And I would say this a little bit generally as well. And I've often have said this at every opportunity with the police, is that they really do need to take an interest in building the relationships with the specialist services in their area. So that's specialist domestic abuse services, including buy and force services, because at that point of first contact, the police need to be doing that signposting, which allows for a victim and survivor to feel they have someone standing alongside them. And that doesn't mean, you know, to criticize the police necessarily. It might be that an advocate in a buy and force service would need to advocate with the police, but it's all the range of everything else. And I think missing that opportunity is a real problem, and that I often hear, for example, police forces who haven't prioritized building those relationships, that loses out on so much opportunity. It's not so much about the criminal justice response, it's about just that opportunity to bridge to services who can do so much. And there's a real, you know, it's not unusual for me to hear the police just signposting to say one service that really is only aiming at focusing on, say, a restraining order, a non-molestation order. Well, that might solve one issue, but that's not a holistic service. So it's really getting police to commit to all that it takes to refresh and build those relationships so that they have that really good kind of signposting and that referral, which sounds a little bit like it's not just about doing that, it's about how you then work together throughout. So that's really important. The second point I would make is something that, you know, we used the powers of the office to ask the Home Office. It was late in the calendar year, so it's, I don't know how many months ago now, but we released a briefing about this, which is how often are the police in each individual force, how often are they passing along information to immigration enforcement? Because that is really important for us to understand. But I've personally not come across one leader within policing or any frontline police officer who said to me that they feel strongly that they should be passing along information. It really does. I have not heard one operational argument that has convinced me that having a firewall would have any detriment. In other words, it only has benefit to make it clear to survivors who are worried about immigration enforcement that it would just be okay to contact the police. So, you know, digging into it in every which way, you know, I think police would, from the people I've spoken to, would welcome that clarity, because they are doing it. They're not doing it at huge levels, but the fact that it's even happening anytime instills that fear about repercussions. So there's a real oddity about holding on to, you know, this policy notion that we should be passing along information. There seems to be a real case for the firewall in a very practical sense for everyone involved.
I would agree. Thank you, Nicole. I think we have time for just one last question. Fiona, I can't see you, but the question is, have you faced any opposition regarding the report being done from a feminist perspective?
I guess the answer to that is we will see, won't we? I mean, as I say, we wanted to draw a bit of a line in the sand, like make clear this is how you do transparent work in this. This is how you do work that you really want other people to reuse, rather than a culture of producing work which only the owner can really hold on to and use. So we'll see how that goes down. But I mean, our hope is that people use it. That's what we want. And not just for this cohort, but for broader cohorts. And yeah, yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you, Fiona. I've just been told that we're unable to put the link to the feedback survey in the chat, but that it will be emailed to everyone that signed up today. And again, just to remind you, if you could just take a few minutes out to fill it out, it would we'd greatly appreciate that. That just leaves me to thank our incredible panelists, and in particular to Lavanya, who stepped in last minute. Thank you very much. Investing in safety is a resource designed by organizations that in reality are extremely resource constrained. It's our hope that you will take the calculator, the report, and the research behind investing in safety with you and use it to drive support for by and for services supporting victim survivors with no recourse to public funds. To all the commissioners in the room, I hope there's still some left, we hope you will use the cost benefit calculator to create an invest to save business case and subsequently fund by and for service outcomes for victim survivors with no recourse to public funds, scaled to the level of your local need. Lastly, thank you to everyone for attending and for your engaging questions. And just again, a last reminder to fill out our feedback survey and to use and amplify these resources. Thank you.